This video picks up where the last one titled, "We Want to Be Like You," left off. So you might want to go back and watch that one first if you haven't seen it. So last time, we cracked open the book of 1 Samuel, where we saw how the Israelites decide that they had had enough of being just a loose confederation of tribes without a centralized leader. And they asked the prophet Samuel to appoint a king so they can be like all the other nations. Now, Samuel is the main authority figure in Israel at this time. Way back in chapter 4, we learned that all Israel from Dan in the far north to Beersheba in the far south recognized that Samuel was attested as a prophet of the Lord. So everybody knows that Samuel is God's go-to guy. And Samuel really hates the idea of a monarchy. He had planned for his sons to inherit his role, but even more than that, he's concerned that a king will use his power to amass all kinds of wealth for himself, and the people will suffer as a result. And God isn't too keen on the idea either. He also sees the pitfalls of the giving of all kinds of power to just one man. But God also knows that Israel can still be his light to the world, even if they have a king. Here's the thing, though. It's got to be the right kind of king. If Israel's first king turns out to be like his counterparts in surrounding nations, he'll consider it his right to tax people heavily. He's going to need all that money to support his many wives and horses and perfumers. He'll show favoritism to other elites and show little regard for the needy. That's a king like all the other nations have. And Israel has some expectations for its king as well. He needs to defend the nation against its enemies and to conquer more territory to expand the borders. He needs to produce heirs to begin a dynasty. And he needs to build a temple for national worship. And he needs to see that some justice is done. That's also a king like all the other nations have. Now, God's vision would be in line with a portion of this, but if we look at some of the Psalms, and there are actually 10 of them that scholars classify as the royal Psalms, we can get a sense of what might be most important to God as he sets out his vision for Israel's first king. Listen to some snippets from Psalm 45. My heart is stirred by a noble theme as I recite my verses for the king. You are the most excellent of men, and your lips have been anointed with grace. In your majesty ride forth victoriously in behalf of truth, humility, and righteousness. And how about Psalm 72? Endow the king with your justice, O God. He will deliver the needy who cry out and the afflicted who have no one to help. He will rescue them from oppression and violence, for precious is their blood in his sight. Sure, I've picked out the specific parts of these psalms to make my point, but still, aren't these ideals amazing? The king will care deeply for the lowest of the people. His majestic palace will be awarded because of his just and beneficial rule, not because he kills somebody in a coup or happens to be the oldest son of the last guy. So that's a king. Not a king like all the other nations have, though. Now that we've laid that groundwork, let's meet our first Israelite king. 1 Samuel 9 begins, there was a Benjamite, a man of standing, whose name was Kish. Kish had a son named Saul, as handsome a young man as could be found anywhere in Israel, and he was a head taller than anyone else. This is a really unique introduction. The Bible very rarely says much about anybody's physical appearance. We have no idea what Moses or Joseph even looked like. But our narrator emphasizes that Saul definitely looks the part of a king. He's already taller than anybody, so people have been looking up to him for a long time. He's super handsome, so getting started on that dynasty, not going to be a problem. His father Kish is a man of standing, Gabor Chayil in Hebrew, which means strength, wealth, confidence. So from the get-go, from the outside, it looks like Saul is an obvious choice. The narrator chooses to be very clear in these first few details about Saul, but don't expect much more of this as we go forward. One of the tools the writer is going to use with extraordinary skill as he unfolds his story is ambiguity. He is purposely not clear about many of the details and motivations of our characters, so there is wide room for us to arrive at differing conclusions about what we're reading. Ambiguity is a central characteristic of much of the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, and it's part of what makes reading the Bible so compelling. It's what drives the fact that thousands of years later, we're still debating the true merits of King Saul and his prophet Samuel. Let's take, for example, what we learn next about Saul in chapter 9. Kish, Saul's father, has given him an errand. He's to take one of the servants and go find some lost donkeys. Let's pick it up in verse 5. When they reached the district of Zuph, Saul said to the servant who was with him, "Come, let's go back, or my father will stop thinking about the donkeys and start worrying about us." But the servant replied, "Look, in this town there is a man of God." Now he's talking about Samuel here. "He is highly respected, and everything he says comes true. Let's go there now. Perhaps he will tell us what way to take." Saul said to his servant, "If we go, what can we give the man? The food in our sacks is gone. We have no gift to take to the man of God. What do we have?" The servant answered him, "I have a quarter of a shekel of silver. I will give it to the man of God so that he will tell us which way to take." "Good," said Saul to his servant. "Come, let's go." So they set out for the town where the man of God was. Now it's a simple exchange, right? But let's look at a couple of different ways to read it. First, let's be pro-Saul. His father gives him responsibility to recover lost property. They're at it a while, and Saul becomes concerned that his father will grow worried about their safety. Out of respect for his father, he suggests that they return home without the donkeys. The servant has an alternate suggestion, to contact a seer, which makes some sense, and Saul's open to considering it. He points out an obstacle. They don't have anything to give the seer, which the servant clears up, and Saul adopts this improved plan, even though he didn't come up with it. He's a guy whose ego isn't shattered when a servant isn't a yes man, and he's ready to enlist the help of others to achieve a common goal. Now that's one completely correct way of reading it. But now let's read it again, but not favor Saul. Saul's father Kish is a wealthy man with a lot of big concerns. He'd like to assign his son Saul to negotiate something more important, but Saul's really more suited just to locate the donkeys who have strayed. Saul and the servant give this a valiant effort, but it's getting late, and Saul's getting discouraged, so he decides to pack it in for the day. The servant, however, takes initiative where Saul doesn't, and suggests that they visit the seer who lives in that district. We know from chapter 4 that all Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, knows about Samuel and his prophetic gifts, but somehow Saul's in the dark. When the servant suggests an alternative to giving up the search, Saul throws up another roadblock about paying him, which the servant also overcomes. So the servant is industrious and informed, but Saul, though a head taller, comes up short by comparison. So, which reading do you think is the right one? From what the text tells us, it could go either way. That's the frustrating, beautiful nature of ambiguity. And there's more. We already know that both God and Samuel think Israel's making a mistake in requesting a king. If the first king is a dud, this may prompt Israel to say, "Wow, that was a bad idea. Wish we had Samuel back as our prophet, priest, and leader." At least Samuel could say, "I told you so." We also know that the story of history is most often told by the victors. At the risk of giving too much away, I'm just going to say that Saul and his Benjamite tribe, they don't come out on top. David and his tribe of Judah are the eventual winners in the competition for the throne. David's supporters are largely producing this story, so we have to keep that in mind. In addition, we could be working with a group of incredibly clever, creative, and inspired writers who have observed and are recording all of the complex motivations of our characters. Kings and prophets, and you and me, we're all a mixed bag of honorable and flawed. And they want us to avoid concluding that someone is either always a hero or always a villain. They are crafting an intentionally ambiguous text which allows for many of these possibilities. As Samuel oversees Saul's progression from a finder of donkeys to Israel's first king, the story's ambiguities, they just keep coming. Join in next time to find out more. So thanks for coming along on this short journey into the Bible text. I hope you've noticed something new in the landscape, or maybe even a fresh way to view territory that you've covered many times before. Whatever the case, it's good to have you along for the trip. You never know what we might discover as we crack open this fascinating text together.